Hello everyone, I'm Ali Aboud. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Economics and a university fellow at the Isam Faris Institute. On behalf of the Department of Economics, the Isam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, and the Institute of Financial Economics, I would like to welcome you all in this event. So in this talk, our guests are going to discuss topics of the time on inequality, globalization, and democracy. The event hosts two distinguished scholars, Dr. Branko Milanovic, a research professor at the City University of New York and senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socio-economic Inequality, and Dr. Ishac Diwan, professor of practice in economics and associate fellow at IFI. Dr. Milanovic's scholarly work on inequality is highly influential. He also writes about inequality, capitalism, and politics to the general audience. His books and articles on these subjects are widely read. Dr. Ishac Diwan joined AUB in the fall of 2024. He's an expert on international finance, development, and political economy. Most recently, he held academic position at the Paris School of Economics, Columbia University, and the Harvard Kennedy School. Branko and Ishac are, I guess, old-time friends from the World Bank days, and we're happy to bring them back here together to discuss inequality and globalization and democracy. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ali. Branko, welcome to Beirut, finally.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Of course, it's a pleasure to be here, and everybody to whom I write always say, well, you must be really enjoying Beirut, and I do.
That's great. So indeed, we met a while ago, and you literally spent your days and night when I knew you looking at inequality numbers. I think nobody in the world has as much knowledge about measuring various aspects of inequality as you have. Even Piketty doesn't. He just looked at the 1%. You looked at the in countries, across countries, share of labor in GDP, share of capital, really any aspect one can think about. And I mean, my first question is, why you got interested so young and for a whole life on inequality? It did end up being an amazing angle at understanding this chaotic world in which we live. But what got you interested so early?
Well, first, Ishac, let me thank you for these very nice compliments. I'm not sure that they are fully deserved. After all, Piketty is about 15, 16 years younger than I, so he has,
the benefit of your work.
Yeah, he has, but obviously he is a totally, I think he transformed the work on income distribution. But let me go back, to the question that you asked me, because often I'm asked that, and then I go back to where I got interested in inequality. And I got interested when I was studying undergraduate in then Yugoslavia, today Serbia, in Belgrade, and I did statistics, okay? So I was fairly good in mathematics those days, and I did statistics. And we would study traditional statistics, but really with zero applications. So you would just draw the curves, you would have this distribution, normal, chi-square, t-student distribution, power law. And then I discovered, I cannot remember exactly how, but I discovered that actually income distribution is also a distribution. It has certain features. Finally, I can apply what I'm learning mathematically to some real world issue. And on the other hand, I had a fairly strong sort of Marxist background, not so much, actually, interestingly, not so much because of Yugoslavia, to some extent, yes, because I was interested in communism as an ideology. But believe it or not, in high school in Belgium, where I went, the high school that was early 70s was very Marxist in reality. And so I said, okay, I'm interested in social issues, and here I'm interested in mathematics, and the only place where I can apply that is distribution functions. And that's how my interest actually began, and then, of course, continued ever since.
So then, because you just kind of stumbled on that topic, you wrote Capitalism and Globalization. No, Visions of Inequality.
Yeah.
Which I read, Global Inequality, Capitalism Alone, The Haves and the Have-Nots, The World Under Capitalism, and a few other books, right? And you're a compulsive author. I can't keep up with him. I mean, you could just read his blogs and his tweets, and it's 50% of your time. So somehow inequality as an entry point into understanding the world in which we live ended up being, enormously productive.
Well, I was lucky, as you mentioned. It's actually, when I think of students now, people follow their own interests, but oftentimes they follow what is being very popular that moment, and I'm old enough to remember different popular topics that people followed. I remember 1990s, there were, importabilization was a big topic. In the World Bank, many people did it. Then gradually faded out, and now we have actually the opposite of importabilization. So now people would study mercantilists, and actually, believe it or not, I am reviewing now a book, and I see now mentions of people whom I've never read, like, for example, Monchrétien, who was writing before Adam Smith and who was a mercantilist. Suddenly, these guys are coming back. So what young people do, often they follow what is then the main topic. That's good, but sometimes you're unlucky, the topic just fades away. And in my case, I was very lucky that inequality came out of, it was a sleeper topic, as you know, and it just came, it became big. So I was lucky.
So as you were working on inequality, you were very lucky because neoliberalism was created, and then globalization and the movement of capital and the fall of the Soviet Union and the WTO and then the Reagan Thatcher revolution, and all the way to rising inequality in the US and several financial crises, and now you are still alive and you say globalization is dead and it was born just a few years ago. So we're going to try to clarify. We're going to use this conversation to try to use inequality as a lens to try to structure a little bit the chaos in which we live, right? I mean, here we have now Trump. It looks like very sudden what he's doing, withdrawing from trade agreement, threatening neighbors, doing illiberal policies, threatening to roll back globalization. It looks very sudden. You're going to show us that actually things have been happening for a while. So I propose to do that in several phases. Maybe if you show us some facts, we put some facts on the table. We look at what happened to globalization. You've produced some amazing graphs over your life that speaks very loud. So show us the best you have, and then we'll try to, in the first phase, to figure out, what's the impact of these big changes. Why has inequality moved the way it has? We try, of course, the word is very complicated, try to speak a little bit about that. And then from there, we move on about the reaction and where we are here today, How about that?
Well, looks great. I totally agree. I would just move over there and do the slides. I have to say, however, that you will see that in the slides, and as Ishac mentioned, I, of course, would be very keen, and you will see at the very end, to have a discussion about where we are standing now and what would be the next steps and all that. But recently I've noticed, and I had to always say that, we should not be really obsessed, as many people are, with Trump. Trump is a symptom of a problem, not necessarily, well, he may be part of the problem, but one should not really over-focus on him. So that's why I wanted to say that, and you will see that in the presentation that I have.
Very good.
So should I move?
So step one, the facts, and then clarifying questions. Step two, what explains the fact? These are facts over 100 years. What forces explain the facts? And third phase, really conversation. Where are these dynamics potentially taking us?
Well, it looks great. Actually, thank you very much for the introduction. As you can see, this is a discussion. Can you hear me well? Is it okay? Maybe I'm too close. Maybe it's too strong. Okay, let's go through the facts, and I would be fairly brief because obviously, and particularly people who were here 2 days ago, I presented much more detailed graphs and data, but this is Okay, this is a very hard graph to understand at first, okay? So don't feel bad if you don't understand it. What does it show? Suppose that you just look at the height of the total bar. So add the blue and red part together. Okay, that shows you the height of the bar, shows you the level of global inequality. The level of global inequality, and I will not go into the data now, so believe me, that's done reasonably well. The level of global inequality is inequality that exists between individuals in the world. Income of each individual in the world, or rather the household in the world, transformed into so-called PPP dollars, which means dollars of equal purchasing power. In other words, we have to adjust for the fact that $1 in India pays more, gets you more food, for example, than $1 in Norway. Okay. So after all of this adjustment, what you see here, the data start from 1820, you see that the level was relatively low. In other words, that actually one has to make sort of a mental adjustment to that. The world inequality between individuals at the end of the Napoleonic Wars was relatively low. And it was low because the world was poor. And essentially the gaps between Europe and Asia, which would drive inequality in the 19th century, were small. The gap between the richest countries like England and the Netherlands and poor countries like China was 3 to 4 to 1. And that gap became 20 and 30 to 1 at the peak of inequality in the 20th century. So that's essentially what happened. As you can notice, in the 19th century, we have steady increase in global inequality because some countries become rich, other countries, especially India and China, stay at the same level or go down. Then on the 20th century, most of it we have a plateau of inequality, very high inequality with the three worlds. And then now we have a decline in inequality driven by the rise of Asia. So if you want, this is the story of the 2 centuries in a nutshell. When you divide that story into the blue part and the red part, you have a story of between country inequality, which is blue, which is driving this whole process, and the story of red part, which is inequality within countries, which also to some extent, particularly in the 19th century and even today, was driving it too, but maybe less importantly. And that's why I call the 19th century the century of colonialism and basically European expansion to the rest of the world and the class struggles within countries. And of course, the more recent period is the period of the rise of Asia, where actually the differences within the Euro-Asian continent are going back to what they were before the Industrial Revolution. So that's kind of a story, and of course that can be sort of, unwrapped in many different ways and discussed and so on, but I really would like you to sort of see that there was a kind of inverted U shape in the movement of global inequality. Now, what was the most recent things which have happened? We all know that the middle classes in the rich countries somehow are unhappy. So we all know that, and that of course explains the so-called populist movements and so forth. Now, let me show you that on one example in slightly different way. This is the position on the horizontal axis. You have 10 Italian deciles, from the poorest people in Italy, poorest 10%, to the richest 10% in Italy. Now, Italy is a very good country for this graph because Italy has not had any growth in 25 years. So what has happened is that on a blue line, you see the position of the Italian deciles in 1988. And even the poorest Italian decile was then at the 75th global percentile. So if you're poorest decile in Italy, you're still better off than 3/4 of the world. Well, now you're just better off than 56% of the people in the world. So the poorest deciles slide down because they are overtaken mostly by Chinese and other Asian deciles. Now, the top deciles in Italy, as you can see, are not affected because the China effect doesn't go that far. Now, Italian example is more dramatic, but if you do the same thing for Germany, Japan, US, or any other country, rich country, you would find more or less the same result. I mean, the shape would be the same, but of course the decline would not be as dramatic. So that's something to keep in mind when we talk about the effects on the middle classes. Now, that rise of Asia has a geopolitical effect. The geopolitical effect is that China and India and other countries have become much more important players than they used to be. Now, the graph on the left shows you the share. Now, this is the total GDP, includes population as well. Share of US and China. The US, of course, share starts after World War II. On the vertical axis is the share of the US in total global production. And it starts almost 40%. You know, when people speak of make America great again, some of them have this idea of America producing 40% of global GDP. Well, that's never going to happen again, simply because at that time, US was a prosperous country and actually became more prosperous during World War II. At the same time, Europe was totally destroyed, Germany, even France, Russia, I mean, the Soviet Union was totally destroyed, Japan was destroyed, China was in a civil war, and India was a colony. So, and Africa was poor. So it was really the US, basically, and Australia and New Zealand that were strong, I mean, countries that benefited from the war. But what we see here is that China was, of course, really at the bottom, 2% of global GDP in 1952. And then, of course, it overtook the US in 2015. So China is now producing 22% of the global GDP, US 17. But very striking thing, of the scale is different, however, is India versus the UK. In 1980, India and the UK both had the same total production. Well, India now has 4 times as much as the UK. So it's a dramatic change, as you can see there. We basically have India and China producing 1/3 of the global output, and they used to produce 5%. So this is, within a lifespan, it is something quite extraordinary to see what happened. Now, finally, what happened to internal inequalities? I will go very quickly over this graph that shows you the change in real income across the entire US distribution, which is on the horizontal axis. As you can see, the vertical axis shows average rate of growth annually per person. The entire middle class and the lower classes grew at about 1% per annum. You know, the increase at the very bottom is the result of COVID, actually, policies. That bottom, very bottom, is now a little bit over 1% because they really benefited in 2020 from large government transfers. Now, of course, the top grew at more than 2%. So that increased inequality in the US. So that's quite well known. You know, there are millions of works of that and studies. But I want also to mention one thing which I will very briefly mention. What is also happening in the US, and I think it's important to realize, and also in other rich countries, is, forget even about the graph, but just the whole idea that if you take the 10% of the richest Americans, increasing share of this 10% are also very rich by capital income and by labor income. That has never happened in history, that you have rich people who are also rich as capitalists and richest wage earners. You know, think of the traditional capitalist model. Yes, the top people are rich, but they're really having most of their income from property. But now we have not only rich lawyers or software engineers. We have rich software engineers and lawyers who are at the same time rich capitalists. So this combination of what they call homoplutia is absolutely unique, and it's actually increasing in all the countries. And put on that meritocracy, and you basically have an elite. And I think that's what actually is happening simultaneously with the decline of the middle class. And finally, that was also reflected in what is called the elephant chart, which shows you globally now, so we are now here at global level, globally shows you, imagine that the people in the B are basically American middle class, people at the point A are Chinese middle class, and people at point C are American oligarchs or plutocrats. So what has happened during globalization, high globalization period, is that people at A, Chinese middle class, have grown very fast. Everybody knows that. People at B, Americans, have really not grown almost at all. We know that as well. And people at C, American oligarchs, have also grown fast. So the political problem, and that's why it is relevant for today, as actually Ishac said, is the political choice. If you're at a point at that position, you have 2 possibilities. One possibility, you basically say, okay, I really don't like this globalization. I want point A, which is China, to go down, and I want my point B to go up. So I go after globalization. Or you can say, okay, I don't like it, but I'm going to take lots of money from my plutocrats by increasing tax rates and so on, and I will improve the position of point B and reduce position of point A. I think that's the essential dilemma which existed and exists in many rich countries. I will not tell you which sort of solution was chosen because I think it's rather obvious today. And finally, I want to say something about China because we forget that at the same time we have had a massive increase in inequality in China. Now, this graph shows that by first looking at the size of the bar. Now, as the bar goes up in size, what is happening is that the top 5% get more and more of total income in China. But notice another thing which is quite dramatic. The blue color is income which they receive from the private sector, and the red is the income which they receive from the state sector. And what you have here is a major transformation over 30 years where basically China, the Chinese elite, used to be essentially elite of state-owned enterprises, government officials, and people like that. And then became an elite of private sector people, a professional managerial class. So that was really a major transformation in China. And I think I will stop now, and I'll put just these questions that I don't even need to read, because I think they're...
No, let's ask if there are some questions of clarification.
Yes, so let's do that.
Okay.
Just in the previous graph, what was foreign?
I think it's actually from foreign-owned enterprises, where I mean people who have wages from foreign-owned enterprises.
Others? No. So let's stay on the elephants. This really is what made Branko a superstar. I mean, because this is an amazing graph, right? It summarizes a lot of what you've said, right? That basically globalization has been good for the global middle class of the South, mostly. You know, they moved, this is the change in revenue between 88 and 2008. This is what, 30 years? And their income has increased by like 70% at point A. That's basically the southern middle class, right? Chinese,
Right,
Indian,
exactly, yeah. Indonesian, Vietnam.
Indonesian, what have you.
Yeah.
The American middle class, and to some extent the Europeans, they maybe were a little bit more protected, no?
No, I think if you
Not
look at
really.
the three big countries, Japan, Germany, and the US, that's 500 million people. You take half of their distributions, 250, and each of them had really very, I mean, Japan almost zero, Germany very little.
So they stayed at point B. Basically, they had zero growth in their income between 88 and 2008, 20 years. Right. And then you have the 1% or the 10% that did extremely well. And actually, as we know from Piketty, if you look at the 0.1%,
they did even better.
They did increasing amazingly well.
Yeah.
So that's the picture. Let's sit down again and take it from there. So maybe first phase, before we move into, you know, the conflicts and the potential and how the world can change from here, let's first understand why what happened. I mean, there are many forces that have been driving these things. What would be the 3-4 main forces before we get into them, if you want to list them?
You know, I think the main two, and that's what the debate was throughout, the early 2000s, was a debate between technological change, people who believe that actually what we see here is driven by technological change with so-called skill-biased technological progress that made actually returns to labor higher, that made also capital working with high-skilled labor more productive, and that really technological change and also possibly sort of other changes like ability to ship more cheaply across the world and so on. Other people believe that the main driver was globalization. In other words, the ability of the US to produce things offshore, replace American labor, which was expensive, by Chinese labor that was cheaper, so globalization was key. Other people, actually, for example, Piketty, believe that really very large role was played by policy. In other words, policy, they started, as you mentioned, with Reagan and Thatcher, neoliberalism, a reduction of taxation on the top and all of that. I have not empirically worked on that debate, so I cannot say much. I think that basically what I called it is overdetermined because the three things really worked often together. We can, of course, discuss that a lot, but I would say, maybe you can correct me, maybe you said 4 forces, but maybe there was something else too. But basically, I think these are the...
Yeah, no, this is a good summary. So basically, trade in goods equalizes, right? So allows countries to catch up, to converge towards the rich, and potentially weakens the middle classes in the rich countries, especially if there is no redistribution. And there has not been redistribution. What we have seen happening more recently with Clinton is a lot of lending, actually, to the poorer people through mortgages and the like, which has, given rise to several financial crises in a row. Actually, the very rich save a whole lot, and so there have been more savings in the world, interest rates were lower, and a lot of this debt was used, right, to try to reduce the social tensions that were created by this inequality. But to go back, so trade in goods been equalizing with little redistribution in the West. The movement of capital, that's your neoliberalism.
Yes, that's,
So what has that done? Capital moves around the world. It's a bit of a rat race to whichever country is cheaper, pushes wages down.
As I said,
what happened to the labor
cannot,
share of income?
I tend to, of the 3 forces that I mentioned, I tend to believe that globalization was the main driver, but there is lots of discussion there, the papers by David Author, which basically argued that, but many other people believed in technological progress. But in a very simplest way, and Ishac would remember that from the long time ago in the World Bank, when actually that was noticed, people would say, well, Heschel-Orin, theorem would say, poor countries like China would export labor-intensive products. Consequently, it would raise the domestic wages of unskilled labor, and then actually it would be good for inequality. Reduce inequality, whereas, of course, in the rich countries, the opposite would happen. But what happened is that actually in all the countries, you had massive increase in inequality. China's inequality, of course, being a socialist country that became capitalist, it actually shot. I didn't show it here, but, China's inequality is today higher than the American inequality. So, you had an increase in inequality in China, in the US, in Russia, in most of West European countries. For example, people still talk about Swedish egalitarianism, but Sweden has changed. When I was young, it was an egalitarian country. Now it's a fairly unequal country with extremely unequal wealth distribution. So things have changed, and so that's where economists were really puzzled.
So basically, trade has equalized between countries. That's the catch-up effect. And then the movement of capital and movement of technology have been unequalizing within country, right?
I actually think that economists, in my opinion, in those days, 20 years ago, were really focusing mostly on labor. And I think there was an ideological reason with which I discussed in Visions of Inequality. But then Piketty came, and rightly, he brought, although Tony Atkinson did it a little bit also before him, he brought capital back. Right. And there was a title, is Capital is Back. So we really forgot that capital not only is an important source of income, but it's very unequally distributed, and particularly when it is badly or taxed, it becomes a major source of inequality. So, this capital movement's ability to actually increase rate of return, and as Piketty claimed that rate of return would stay stable regardless of the increase in capital intensity of production, meant that basically we had forces of capital and labor jointly working towards higher inequality.
Right. And so this is reflected in the share of capital in GDP, which has risen from 50 to 60, 70% in different countries.
Well, it has risen everywhere, actually. Huh? It has actually, there was a very nice IMF paper a couple of years ago, because IMF has the data for many countries that normally, that's not OECD only, and you basically find increased capital share almost everywhere.
Almost everyone. So that's one strong force. And on technology, what we're seeing is the return on education going up. The educated gain much more, and the uneducated wages are pretty much flat, because technology favors jobs for the educated, right?
Absolutely. So basically, if you were to summarize, you could say in a very sort of rough way, but I think not inaccurate, returns to education went up, which means that more skilled people gain compared to less. The share of capital went up, which means that rich people who own capital benefit. And taxation policies became much more lenient, which again means that rich people benefit more. So you had really sort of like perfect storm.
Yeah. No, there's one more that makes it really a perfect storm, which is the winner takes all. And the rise of the oligarchs. It's not even the 1%. It's, as Bernie Sanders would say, the 0.00001%. A huge fortune. Literally, point C is an oligarchic group right now.
But as you said, actually, and I really have to say that so that there is no mistake there, this point C is really not, strictly speaking, because this is based on service. This is not billionaires there. You know, they are not part of the survey. These are really fairly affluent people, part of the top 1 or 5% in many rich countries. And just to give you an idea, 11 or 12% of Americans are part of the global top 1%. So we are not talking here about, Elon Musk. That's actually, other richer people appear in Piketty's data because of fiscal data, and the top of top people, they really don't appear anywhere except on the Forbes lists.
Right. So now we look at this map. I mean, in normal time, what would these B people do in a proper democracy? It seems to me they would just tax C. They would distribute the benefits of that larger pie more equally, right? What have we seen in terms of tax rates in rich countries?
You know, I have not followed that systematically, but I had one observation which I've made several times, and I was not contradicted, so I suppose it must be generally true, because somebody would contradict me. The observation is essentially we have had so much talk about inequality in the last 15 years. But if you look at policies made by the rich countries, take France, take the US, take Italy, take Germany, there are no policies that really were addressing inequality. You know, there was no major change compared to 1980s. You remember in 1980s, actually, when Mitterrand decided to change policies from nationalization to privatization, things have changed then very quickly. And well, over 10 years, 5 years. But now we have been talking and talking and talking. Tax rates in the US actually even went down, then went slightly up the marginal tax rate, then again down, but really lots of talk, no action. And now, whether the movements of the right are explained by that, I don't know. But there is certain kind of association between the disaffection of the middle classes. In my new book, I call them the malcontents, and what we see, actually, in the political arena.
So the marginal tax rate after the Second World War was in the 80%.
Yeah, it was like, although it was a very small number of people who would be paying, but you know, it was, in the US, was really very, very high. And
now it's in the 30%.
Well, I know I'm paying it, 37.5.
Right. And so, I mean, taxes are regressive. Mostly.
Well, no, they are progressive, but they're not as progressive. No, the direct tax is progressive. In other words, percentage-wise, the rich people pay less than the middle, percentage-wise, than they pay more than the middle class and the poor. So they are progressive. But the level of, no, I think they're progressive, but I think the level of progressiveness has become much less. And it is quite possible, but that we really don't know for sure, but it's quite possible in the US that the very, very top, the ones that you are talking about, mentioned before, 0, 0, 0, I actually think that there is possibility that their taxes are, that it goes up and up and then goes down, because they use many of the schemes, including trust funds, lower taxes on capital incomes and so on, to actually to avoid taxation and to move the money to other jurisdictions. So when you see that Trump has paid zero tax over 20 years, okay, it's a little bit unusual. But I have to tell you, I was talking to, well, this guy is not a great genius, but at least he's my tax attorney. He says all the rich people in Washington pay low tax because they find schemes to avoid taxation.
Right. And so the progressive proposal is to actually tax wealth, because wealth is much harder to hide than income. Right.
Right. It would be actually good, and of course, there are some movements in that direction. So maybe I should correct myself what I said before. On the wealth side, yes, there are some. As you know, minimum corporate tax has now been accepted, 15%. So that's a movement in the right direction.
So the G20, for example, of Lula has, in their final declaration, has supported a global wealth tax, so that the rich get taxed.
Yeah.
A way to move out of B by dealing with C, your domestic problem. And there is this OECD agreement for minimum corporate tax of 15%, so that corporations don't all hide in Ireland and pay no taxes. But as you've noticed, the first thing Trump did was take the United States out of this agreement. And so that's part of global public goods that we're starting to lose.
But Ishac, I think actually what is nice part of this graph, as you actually said, is honestly, like this is the point already in 2016, which was obvious. And so if one looks at Trump's policies, and also to some extent European policies, but Trump is more open, so it's very clear to see it. He says, okay, I want to increase the position of point B by essentially going to trade wars with everybody, and especially China, and driving the point A down. So I want to make globalization work better for middle-class Americans, and I really want China to do less well. And I think we are now in a situation, I believe, of a lose-lose situation. But from the strategical point of view, and actually there was a paper in Foreign Affairs on that, and there was also a paper by a Chinese institute on that. If the US loses, let's suppose, 1% of GDP, but China loses 2% of GDP, and I think everybody agrees that the cost to China would be higher than the US, then the relative position of the US improves. So then they say, yes, I lose and you lose. Well, in the Middle East, you know this policy well, right? You lose and I lose, but you lose more than I, consequently, I'm better off.
Good to see you again. It's been a while. I'm Khaled Abu Ismail from ASQA. Thank you, Dr. Milanovic. It's really great to see this chart again. Of course, for us who work in the poverty and inequality business, we are quite familiar with it. Now, just a quick question. This is 1988 to 2008, right? Okay, so, and it's in 205 PPP. So let's say we do it from 208 till today. What's the picture? So that's my first question. And in 2017 PPPs, I'm assuming. Now, Vladimir and myself have been working a lot on global inequality and global poverty. And there's a reason why we're doing that. Usually regional commissions, the UN ESCO wouldn't do that. But because of the poverty of poverty measurement tools at the global level and the complete lack of, explanation that they have if you use fixed lines like the 215, we had to come in and say, okay, well, if this doesn't make sense, and if the Atkinson report has suggested, for example, you do something different, like you mix relative and absolute in the same measure, and if the bank comes up and says the societal poverty line, which is essentially a fixed relative line, then you have to come up with an alternative. And the alternative we come up with shows us some very interesting results. It shows us that indeed there has been poverty reduction, and indeed, from compared to 95 to 2004, a lot of countries worldwide have reduced their poverty significantly. But if you take China and India out of the picture, it's not a phenomenal rise of the middle class story. And in fact, many regions, sub-Saharan Africa, maybe after 2010, the Arab region, you've
So you're taking 3 billion people out of the picture?
I'm just saying
It's a lot
that
of people.
it's important. It is important to realize that when you take them out, the narrative changes a lot, but even when you include them, and you use different poverty metrics, you realize that we completely underestimated the number of poor by objective standards worldwide. And maybe 2/3 of the world population is either poor, moderately poor, or even vulnerable to poverty. Okay, not 2/3, about 52%. And that just shows you how precarious the so-called global middle class really is. So I just wanted to throw those two ideas at you. Do we have a global middle class that has been exploding by objective standards? And what would happen to that picture post-2008 till today? I'd love to have your feedback on those two.
Okay, excellent questions. I will be very brief. It is true that if you take another 10 years, the picture has changed in one respect. The top 1%, and it's driven by the American, really, top 10% or 5%, has not recovered immediately from the crisis. The crisis, actually, 2008, led to a reduction in their incomes at the very top, and then the recovery. But they never regained rates of growth. These are rates of growth here. Rates of growth that the Chinese middle had. So there was a change in the next 10 years. There is no doubt about that. But we wanted to, of course, show this more dramatic situation, which was during the high globalization. And, I have to mention, this is a joint paper with Christoph Lackner and myself. So when we had this data, we were very lucky that essentially it was really data-driven, but we had from the fall of the Berlin Wall until the financial crisis, and that was the high globalization. So that was the first question. The second is about poverty. I don't deal with poverty, so I totally agree that depending on the poverty line that you draw, you would have different results, but I'm staying out of that. And for the global middle class, the term middle class is very difficult to define. Everybody defines it differently. But the fact is that the global GDP has gone up significantly, and the fact is that the world income distribution, if you draw it as a distribution, as I was saying, what I was a kid and like that distribution, it has really become more symmetrical, looking almost like a distribution in a single country, almost. And that was not the case in 1988.
I want to make two comments on this graph to continue this conversation. First is that, it's not just the Chinese that are in A. There's a whole bunch of people around the world here that have risen. And against that, of course, you have a lot of people in some countries that have not risen. But this global reduction of inequality doesn't really have a constituency that has discretion, that has agency, that can say, we love trade, we want open trade, and the like. There are some people in different countries, while the losers are in one country that can make decisions and that can stop globalization. So that's first. We don't have a united South that is negotiating. We have a fragmented bunch of countries. That's one. And two, in all likelihood, B is going to lose out of this. We know there are estimates of this cost of pulling out of the system is around 10% for the United States. You said maybe more for China. Yeah. But it's a lose-lose war. It's not a win-win war. And so, rather than the real interest of B is not to fight with A and shrink the pie. It should really be to share the growth much more with C. So my sense is that C, this oligarchy, is really using the discontent of B, basically, and the fear of the other, xenophobia, through populism, basically, to attack A as a way of defending C against B taxing it. It's a defensive strategy, which is destructive, not necessarily very sustainable, hopefully over time, certainly extremely destructive for the planet, because instead, what has been built in terms of global public goods and multilateral cooperation is being destroyed at a time where you need cooperation to save the planet. So it's extremely destructive at this moment, right?
No, I agree on all of that. I just simply want to add for people, if they are not totally convinced, is that this particular chart and that particular period was done in many different versions. This is one of the versions. So whatever version you choose, and actually I remember when I first time did it, I did it in US dollars. This is in PPP dollars. That chart survives. And the essential 2 points of that chart are really high growth of the top and absence of growth in point B. And that just simply survives.
If I want just like to have an intermediate question between the question from above and your question. If we were to draw this picture just for the Global South, where Global South includes China, like this way we can think a little bit about the idea of poverty reduction in all the countries in the world, but at the same time think about whether we have really a united Global South. Because some of the rhetoric sometimes you have about China, especially when we talk about globalization, is like that China is also exploitative and like all these things. So like how would the graph look differently?
You know, I have done that because when I published the latest version of this paper recently at World Development, so I would encourage you to go there. It's a long paper. It was like, on my word, it was like almost 100 pages precisely, because in the 4 rounds of referees' comments, they said many things, including like what you said. So yes, it's true, it does change. When you take out China, it's not as dramatic. But you really have, as you said, you have to start, okay, let's get India out. Let's get Vietnam out. Let's get Indonesia out. Let's get Thailand out. Yes, that's true. Africa has not converged. And in that sense, the core versus periphery, if you take China out, it is more, how should I say, the convergence is less. And China is important because 1.4 billion people. But as I said, it is really an Asian story. Yeah. And I really would like to see it, as I mentioned it also, as a story of the return of the relative distribution of economic activity to what it was pre-industrial revolution, because that's what basically it is.
No, I meant we keep China, but just like OECD countries out.
This is the Global South.
Yes, just keep China and India and all the rest of the Global South.
This is the Global North from B to C, and this is the Global South. That is their distribution.
I cannot understand now. Whom do you want to keep? And
no, just like keep all the Global South, including China. Considering
right
China as Global South, excluding the US
right
and the
here.
West.
This is the whole world.
I don't know if you were to exclude the OECD. I don't know. I don't know.
But Branko, this is the Global South.
Yeah, it is a global south, but you know, people are distributed all around the place. You know, the Americans don't go below like a 65th percentile. But you know, people have done, actually, there was, if you're interested, go, Resolution Foundation from London actually attacked me, and then we sent a rebuttal of, 10 pages. They were doing the same thing. You know, they pull out this country, that country, they say, okay, why socialist country, why Russia, so let's get out. Now, Japan, we know they didn't do well, okay, let's get Japan out. Eventually, yes, you're going to change the graph, I don't deny. If you really select 5 countries you want to have, the graph is going to look different. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to raise two points and hear your comments on that.
Sorry, where is the... okay.
Here, okay. So the first point is linked to what you mentioned about the moods and the fashions that brought you to this very interesting production. Well, this duality that has been evocated by yourself and by the person behind about poverty versus inequality. Well, poverty approaches are basically static as opposed to dynamic that you show in yours, where you always or mostly present things in terms of rates of evolution. And the second consideration is that poverty appears as being a moral concern, while inequality is a more political concern, as you show it. So I don't know if you have any comment. What made the prevalence of the poverty over a long period, past period, mainly within World Bank and the narratives by policymakers, etc., etc.? Is it intended to hide the progress that was happening at the level of inequality, or just a mimetic design? The second point is that, well, since inequality is a dynamic process over time, I would like to hear your opinion on the 2 other dynamics that are, well, the spatial dynamic and the demographic dynamic meaning the displacement not over time, because over time, well, people compare their own evolution to those who they can consider as being comparable to them. And therefore, the configuration of space, and I heard from our friends here, remove this or put that, etc. So we are in a place here in Lebanon that might be of some interest because we have almost 3 tiers in the population. One block, maybe 3 million something, of Lebanese nationals residing in Lebanon, almost equivalent number of still holding Lebanese passport, and another one, immigrants, not from long time, maybe for the past 20 years, and a third tier, not far from being equivalent, that is mainly composed of immigrants, poor, mainly from Syria or Palestinians, etc. So this displacement is accompanied in Lebanon by the fact that the comparisons are segmented. What would you help us understand at the level of the, not time dynamics, but spatial segmentation dynamics, including perception and movement of population, effective and perceived?
Again, briefly, I mean, inequality is an enormous topic. You can just look at inequality any different ways. Like, let's suppose I take this group here. I can look at inequality as I do by essentially putting people in different deciles, from the poorest to the richest. I can look at inequality by gender. I can look at inequality by age. I can look at inequality by, people addressed in dark colors or white colors, anything that they want. And by rows, for example. Why not row 1 or 2 or 3? But that's why I'm saying that there are so many aspects that I really deal with only one. On top of that, as you mentioned, there is a perception aspect. There is with whom do you compare yourself, or who are the peers. Just for factual understanding, the in-household service, take the Lebanese case that you explained, people who would be in the survey would be people who are resident in Lebanon at the time of the survey. So the Lebanese who are outside would be in the survey in France or in Cote d'Ivoire or wherever they are. They would not be in this survey. So that's how the numbers are derived. On the first question, why poverty and not inequality, that's a very tricky political question. As Ishac knows, first, he was in the World Bank at the same time. Secondly, I write about that in Visions of Inequality. I think there was a reluctance to work on inequality in international institutions until probably around early 2000s. Poverty was from 1990. The World Bank actually started working very seriously on that, but it was an acceptable topic. And then, let me give you an example. When I joined Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, my resume and all that, and I'll tell now the names because they're all, doesn't matter. Jessica Matthews, who was then the president of Carnegie, tells me, looks at my resume and says, oh, you have too much inequality in this. Why don't you change and just call it poverty? And she says, when we go and do fundraising, the rich people really hate to see the word inequality because that means that you want to grab some money from them. But they love to see the word poverty because they feel good. Look, I'm such a rich guy and I give, And that was the feeling behind. And then I remember when the first, in the research department, when the first unit that dealt with inequality was created, they didn't dare to call it inequality. The first report was equity. We had equity. So equity is kind of nice. Yeah, it's like nice word, like we are all equitable and stuff. But I think there was a reluctance to do that, although nobody really stopped me or a couple of other people working. And then afterwards it changed. And it became an acceptable word. And now I understand that actually Trump wants to get it out again. So we'll see.
It is out even of the website of your university.
Is it? Yeah, is it really out? Because I think they will not get funding, really, if you know.
But, I tell you, at the bank, Martin Ravalion was very famous because he counted the number of the poor.
Yes.
And Branko was there counting everyone.
Yes.
And wasn't as famous as Martin.
No.
But the moment Branko left the bank, because the bank is apolitical, so Wilferson brought in counting the poor, a word out free of poverty. But then the moment you left the bank, you became extremely popular because the world is interested in political issues which have to do with inequality.
No, of course, I was lucky in that sense that inequality became a huge political issue.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then, of course, everybody who worked in inequality really benefited from that. We benefited enormously. But there was some concern. This is being filmed, but that's okay. There was some concern within the research department also about the division of labor. Because, you know, Martin and I did not have exactly the same numbers and the same surveys. And there was a danger that I start producing poverty numbers. You know, okay.
Danger, yeah.
And so Martin says to me, it's like, you know, this division between Portugal and Spain when divided, you know. He says, okay, whatever you do, don't do poverty, and I will not do inequality. And I said yes, and I observed that rule, which he did not fully.
Talking of Martin, there was another Martin Wolf that you
yes.
had discussion with, and that takes us a little bit to not deglobalization, but maybe back to illiberalism. What was this debate about?
You know, the debate was actually Martin.
You know Martin Wolf of
the Financial Times, yes. And we have known each other for a while, and they were always very nice to me. They had interviews, and even they were, you know, very nice to my books. And even I have blurb from Martin Wolf for Visions of Inequality, the latest book. But we had a disagreement essentially because in my blogs, I argued that this shift toward neo-mercantilism was actually pursued very actively under the Biden administration. And the fact is that they increased tariff rates also on China. They actually started controlling technological transfers. They really used sanctions as a big tool for political purposes. So to say now everything was really honky-dory and then bang, Trump comes and reverses everything is not true. And he didn't like that sort of approach. I think the title of the blog of the Substack was how the mainstream, or how the abandoned really the neoliberalism, and without telling us, and that was the sort of disagreement and between us.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, on this, Piketty has today in the Monde an editorial where he argues that that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, having lost the election to Biden, was actually the time where we started moving in that direction. Because they would have fixed the B versus C problem,
I see
and that instead they moved on the B versus A, and actually Trump just continued. So it wasn't a sharp cut with Trump. It was really started by Biden, and the key moment where the West decided where to go was by not electing Bernie Sanders. Would you agree with this?
Yeah, I would agree with that, actually. If you look at, I think the key moment was 2016, essentially, because that was the beginning. And then, of course, Trump's policies were overwhelmed by COVID, and COVID came in and so on. But they fundamentally were continued by Biden. And I think that's the dividing line, even with my liberal friends, including my wife. We have this debate, and the dividing line was 2016, and then Biden continued that. So that's the but people might have different opinions on this. But I agree with what Piketty said. Yeah.
Good. Yes.
Thank you very much. A few questions from what was being said. First, does the measure of middle class in Asia, is it the same as that of the Western middle classes? Are we talking about the same criteria? And are we still in the idea that you become middle class after you start getting $4 per day? I mean, are we using the same criteria? The other question related: would you accept the idea that the three continents are moving to becoming middle class? The fact that the middle class is becoming the major component of the populations of the three continents, meaning the three third world
Europe,
continents.
Asia, and North America.
And lastly, just an anecdote. I liked very much the idea that inequality does not fit in the World Bank. I teach social inequality at AUB, and when I ask what's the opposite of inequality, I am told equity, sir, equity. So we're not in the World Bank, but we like equity.
Yeah, everybody likes equity. You know, it's like, on the first question, if I understood correctly, income is in principle measured equally for everybody, in principle. It is a flow. It's essentially what you earn from labor, capital, self-employment, own consumption, because many people in Africa especially, and of course in Lebanon and other countries, produce their own food and stuff that has to be imputed, value has to be imputed. Then what you receive from social transfers, and deducted for direct taxation that you pay. So the definition is the same, and it's in principle converted into equal units, because as I was saying before, you don't treat $1 the same in every country, because in poorer countries where the price level is lower, that $1 gives you more. And on the middle class, I really avoid I used it today, but I really don't like the term, because you know, what is middle class at the global level? Yes, it is actually median class, but you know, by the Western standards, these guys are not rich. You know, so the middle class in the West is like 3 times. We're talking about maybe $30,000 or whatever per capita, or 40, and in the graph they are actually like 8,000 or 10. I don't go into this whole debate, which also exists. What is the range? You know, what income do you have to be the middle class? I think Latin America had like $5 per day, for example. Or is it $10? I don't remember how much it was.
Nadia Bouali asked me a question before I went to an international conference, and it turned out to be the key area of discussion at this conference. And it's about the U.S., Trump has a trilemma, basically, the story goes. He has promised to cut taxes in the U.S., and that will increase the deficit and the borrowing, and therefore the interest rate in the United States. And that is a problem, because high interest rate means a strong dollar. And the strong dollar defeats what he's trying to do on protection, right? Because the strong dollar makes the US less competitive. He's trying to attract industry at home, and for that he needs a weak dollar. A weak dollar requires low interest rates so that capital does not flow to the United States. And that's a dilemma. I mean, he wants a weak dollar and a strong dollar at the same time. So how...
He's trying to make this new agreement, the Mariana agreement, whereby the other country will help the United States to lower the dollar. Sorry,
help? Yeah, I mean, that they get obliged to actually hold dollars at very low interest rate, right? So, I mean... Exactly. So that is indeed, I think, the rising area of international discussion is how to get, a cheap dollar while at the same time not busting the 100% of GDP debt of the United States, which is what, $50 billion or something like that. And so how to oblige China and Europe to keep their reserves in dollars, but at a very low interest rate. So potentially, people say, what he's building now up is the stake protection as a stake to move to a new Plaza agreement. If you remember, Plaza Hotel agreement was in 1985, when the US wanted a weaker dollar and they obliged all their allies to actually strengthen their currency. This is what actually was the end of the boom in Japan. Japan was the big threat then. And by obliging Japan to revalue the yen, Japan's been in recession ever since. And so potentially the next move is going to be, it seems, indeed what Varoufakis was suggesting. And that's the big fear now. around the financial sector around the world.
Okay, on this, I'm totally out of it, so I'm not, I don't have anything to contribute. But since you mentioned Japan, an interesting feature today is when you look after World War II and add the GDP of the two largest economies. As you remember in the beginning, US was 40% alone, and the Soviet Union became the second largest economy for a while, then was overtaken by Japan. But there was never been a case that the two, now US and China are really big, they're almost half a global GDP. So we have essentially, if we do have a trade war between the two economies that produce half of everything that we produce in the world. And that I think is, it's interesting, and actually I have not done that, but it just occurs to me that economic historians could then calculate easily, actually, well, that's easy, I can even do it using medicine's data. What is the share of, for example, Germany and the UK in 1914, you know, for example, and I don't think it was 40, yeah, I don't know, actually. No.
Other interventions?
But it could be over 30%, yeah. Yeah, there are two more. There is a
just a follow-up remark and a small question. By the way, as you know, the inequality, as you mentioned, is a lot of things and means different things to different people. But if you take into account the reduction in inequalities in human capital, education, for example, or health outcomes, opportunities is another issue. It's been, I think, reducing at even a much faster rate than the reduction in inequalities in income. What implications does that have to people's expectations, perceptions, and the other kinds and convergences to other kinds of equalities, if you will, globally? So that's an interest, because in the Arab region, for example, we've seen that expectations of the youth especially were rising, especially since the 2000s, because youth, the differences, you know, between the rich and poor in terms of secondary education have been remarkably reduced. And that put pressure on the governments, because the old governance systems and the labor markets with the rising informalities were simply not working. To what extent is this or might be happening elsewhere? So that's my first question. The second question is, as you know, the Gini's from the surveys have all mostly have been going down. So if you take the 1995 Gini, 2000 or latest, the 2024 latest, it's been, you know, most of them below the 45-degree line. This doesn't take into account, in most cases, their expenditure or income. It doesn't take into account the 1%, because the surveys don't capture that. If we want to correct for that, as Piketty has done, for example, with the fiscal data, if we want to correct for that and we don't have access to the fiscal data, do you have advice? Could we, for example, be looking to geospatial data? Could we look into geospatial or trade accounts to look at luxury imports? This is something that Vlad and I have also been thinking about. So those two questions just for brainstorming. Thank you.
Well, on the second, I talked to Vladimir about that. I think really I would like to have, I would love to have somebody, but maybe it will happen. And we need, if I work with global data, okay, I need an algorithm which would be global. People have produced lots of things. Vladimir has produced the stuff on Egypt, Jenkins on the UK, enormous stuff. And actually I talked to Jenkins and said, okay, give me an algorithm for China, India, UK, Brazil, Ghana. Nobody can give you that. And so for global corrections, I actually did two different corrections, doesn't matter even how, but from national accounts, I basically saw a discrepancy between the mean income from the surveys and the mean consumption from national accounts. I take that difference, use Pareto, that was actually Tony Atkinson did it first, and distributed to the top 10%. It's arbitrary. I'm not saying it's very good, but I need for global something which is general. I cannot go and take work somebody did, for the US in one way, somebody did for UK differently. No sense. And there are problems, like for example, China. A big problem, which actually I think Piketty's numbers, the assumptions are really a little bit over the top. China has large segment of state-owned enterprises. These state-owned enterprises have corporate profits which they do not distribute, okay? How do you distribute these profits in the personal data? Piketty and his group they say, okay, we have the distribution of wealth, private wealth in China. We assume that the distribution of corporate profits from state-owned enterprises will be the same as the distribution of wealth, private wealth. But it's not the case. I am a private, I'm Jack Ma or somebody. Well, I don't have equal share in the state-owned enterprises. You could even argue that you should distribute that on per capita basis. So we really do not have a way of doing it, at least so far. So that would be my answer.
I hope it's not a technical question.
This one. No, it's, I will, actually I'm curious about, maybe it's a kind of speculation maybe that I'm asking for, but we see these graphs, so I'm just curious, like, can we anticipate that, so the Asian middle classes and the Western middle classes, because at the moment, okay, we see one has been growing and one has not been growing, but there's still, in terms of real dollars, there's still a big difference, right?
Oh, so, yes. We don't have this slide here, but, the median to median between the US and China is 3.2 high. I mean, US median is 3.2 higher in PPP dollars and all that. So there is no doubt that there is still significant difference. However, I mean, that's an interesting exercise that they did. Let me explain how it works. You say, okay, when will China catch up with the US? Okay, when you look at total GDP, it has already taken over. It's higher. Okay. Then you can say, when will it catch up that its GDP per capita would be equal to the US? That's going to take a very long time. Many assumptions, but really it's going to take maybe 50, 70, maybe actually never, as some people say. The third one I think is interesting because I have this microdata, and I said the following. When will the number of the rich Chinese, I take an arbitrary line, which is like US median income, when will the number of the rich Chinese be equal to the number of rich Americans? Rich Americans, by their definition, are half of the American population, means whatever is that, 170 million people. Well, China now has about 40 million people who are like that. And within 20 years, if Chinese growth is 3 percentage points higher than the American growth, they would have the same number of people. So that's basically, we are talking about one generation. But if you're an American policymaker, you can say, well, if this is really going to be on the horizon, I want to go this lose-lose policy. Because that would actually slow down China catching up with me. So I think this is the basic rationale. I think the basic rationale is lose-lose. But you lose more than I.
Great. Thank you. Before closing, I want to say something that Ali forgot to say in the introduction, which is that this, you're the first, thank you, Branko, of a new series that the Econ department, together with our Institute of Finance, are now organizing. We'll organize regular seminars on the global economy. Lebanon's been in crisis for many years, still in crisis, so been very focused on Lebanese affairs. But I think we want to start going back into the world, right? And so we're going to be focusing on global issues every month or so. After you, Hugo Panizza would visit us in a month or so, and we're going to talk about the climate, the climate challenge. So, Branko, thank you so much for starting this series, for being here, and all of you for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for the questions.